Okay, honestly, I am not a very big podcast person, so when choosing a podcast for this assignment, I decided to choose something that was not on the list, but the one that I actually already enjoyed listening to, because I felt that there must have been something about the podcast that keeps it entertaining enough for somebody who doesn't actually like podcasts to listen to. So the podcast I chose to review is Schnitt, titled as such because of a play on words with the host name Schnitt. This podcast is actually concluded after 95 episodes, but I still really enjoyed coming back to this podcast and hearing the stories within it, so I wanted to evaluate why that is. Schnitt is what I would call a very girl talk podcast. Schnitt is a self-proclaimed girly girl and talks about her experiences as a college student and into her new adulthood, which I think is how she garners interest from the audience. Engaging the audience is really about targeting a specific market, at least in my opinion, and the host of this podcast knows her audience. In the 3 episodes I re-listened to prepare this review video, Schnitt talked about dating in college, including boys sliding into your DMs and one-night stands, going back to your hometown after a semester away at college, and what it's like to be a young woman in a male-dominated workplace. All of these topics are super relatable and engaging for the target audience of female college students, and I think that keeps listeners interested in the content. This is an upbeat podcast, so I don't know how much emotional response or sense of empathy is garnered, but it's very enjoyable. Listening to podcasts for me is more of a sense of comfort than trying to learn something new, so it just has a very warm feeling to it through the stories and topics covered. The technique that the host uses is an interviewee setup where she has new guests each week to talk about something different. I think that this technique works for this podcast because it keeps the content fresh, as there's always a new perspective for the listener to digest. The back and forth between the 2 storytellers is a good strategy because it breaks up the monotone vibe of a podcast that only has one host. Schnitt intertwines these stories from her interviewees with her own personal stories to create a very warm, comfortable vibe that almost feels like the listener could be a part of a conversation. I appreciate that as a listener because it helps me feel more involved in the story and makes me want to keep listening. The host also edited in fun music snippets, which I loved hearing as it breaks up the content in a nice, snappy way. Ellie's a strong storyteller because she is just telling her own stories, but also genuinely cares about what her guests are sharing as well. It's not really about getting a cutting edge story for her, but just having fun and sharing stories, trying to understand emotions, but having some laughs along the way, which I think just goes along with having that target audience. As far as originality goes, I don't know that this podcast is super original. Honestly, I think it's a more tame version of the infamous Call Her Daddy podcast, but I think that's why this podcast works. Call Her Daddy is a podcast hosted by Alex Cooper, and it is just an explicit sex and comedy podcast, and because of that, it can definitely be intimidating. Schnitt is a successful podcast because it talks about all the things that girls want to talk about, like sex and dating, and have advice on those things, but it's without the intensity that Call Her Daddy does it with. I would say it's more dilute if I had to pick a word, but in a good, safer way. I really love this podcast, and I would highly recommend it to anyone who is looking for a fun, upbeat storytelling podcast and just wants to listen to some good advice about living life as a young woman.